Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find us online at tertiumquids.org. My name is Joe Thomas, and don't forget, Tuesday of this week, primaries across the Commonwealth of Virginia for the Senate nomination to run against Tim Kaine in November. Make sure you find out more at your local unit chair's offices. Meanwhile, we go into something that is perhaps, along with transparency, one of those subjects that comes up more frequently than you'd think after all these years we would have grasped. It's the idea of fair housing and housing in general. And joining us from UCLA, he is somebody you've probably seen on the tube before, UCLA law professor and author of a book called Moving Towards Integration. He is Richard Sander. Professor Sander, welcome to the program. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm great, and thank you for having me, Joe.
Not at all. So what was the motivation? We hear politicians talk about fair housing, income levels, housing inventory and managing all the bells and whistles. Was that what led you to say we need to find an answer to this?
Yeah, to some extent. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 passed just 50 years ago last month, and amazingly, there's never been a serious, comprehensive study of what it did and what it failed to do. Mm-hmm. And so that was our motivation for getting into this. And once we did, it just turned into a fascinating story. It turns out that fair housing laws were pretty effective in lowering housing discrimination rates. That is, how people are treated when they go out and search for homes in the market. Mm-hmm. Discrimination rates, yeah.
And that's sort of the old redlining where realtors would not show people houses in certain neighborhoods based on, their construct and striking a lot of that down. So you're saying it was successful in breaking down that business process? Yeah.
Both real estate agents and landlords and others working in the market, bankers, there's a lot of sign of really serious institutional change in the 1970s and 1980s. And we have some fairly systematic measurements that show the decline in discrimination. So that's remarkable. But that turned out not to be enough to reduce segregation in a lot of metropolitan areas. But it wasn't some. So by 1990, we had about a dozen large metro areas in the United States where segregation had really fallen pretty sharply. Mm-hmm. But we had 40 or 50 large areas where it had barely changed at all. And so that then created a big puzzle that's sort of at the core of the book. What is it that's driving continued segregation? And what difference does it make?
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at the idea how it works in some places and works in others. Does it come down to how the local governments were administering it, Professor?
No, actually, that seems to have had no impact. So let me contrast Chicago and San Diego, which were sort of at the two ends of the spectrum.
Okay.
And there's an index we use called the Dissimilarity Index, where you can measure segregation between blacks and whites on a scale of 0 to 100. So a typical ethnic group in America has an index, say, in the 30s. If you're looking at Italian Americans or Chinese Americans or Jewish Americans. Mm-hmm. Blacks in the U.S. had an index that averaged 92, very close to complete separation in 1970, about the time fair housing started. In Chicago, that fell maybe to about 85 by 1990. But in San Diego, it fell to about 70. Still not as low as other ethnic groups, but a pretty dramatic drop.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is that once it falls into the 70s, it just kind of keeps declining. There's no case on record where segregation has fallen that much in a major area and then it has gone back up. So that's encouraging. The thing that separated San Diego from Chicago is that it had a different demographic structure. So in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of African Americans moving from other metropolitan areas to San Diego. Not so much to Chicago, because San Diego's economy in the 70s and 80s was really taking off. Mm. So by 1990, about 40% of the blacks in San Diego and move there from another metro area. And those folks moving in the fair housing era tend to move into neighborhoods pretty much regardless of race, and were able to do so. So that creates a dynamic where blacks who live in San Diego start seeing these other neighborhoods that are now becoming, at least having some black presence. That changes their behavior, and they start moving to areas that are further away from the existing black concentration. Whereas in Chicago, there's very little of this intermetropolitan moving. It's mostly people moving within the metro area.
Or out, yeah.
Yeah, right. And those moves tend to be short. They tend to be to border areas. So you could have an existing black district, and you'd have a number of neighborhoods the blacks would move into close to that area. But if it's right next to the existing black area, what you tend to have is a process of resegregation. Not always white flight, but at least enough imbalance between black and white demand that the neighborhood gradually turns from white to black. So blacks in Chicago entered a lot more neighborhoods. They had more housing in 1990 than they did in 1970, but they didn't have less segregation.
So it's interesting. It sounds like what I'm hearing, Professor Sander, is that economically speaking, it helps this process if you have a growing or at least a vibrant economy that people want to engage in, as opposed to, especially in the Northeast, where you're watching cities and communities on the fade as it came to their economic opportunities, and more were going on elsewhere.
Yeah. But the great thing from a policy standpoint is that we can sort of simulate that effect. In other words, cities can't really control whether they're going to suddenly, go into an economic boom in the next 20 years. But they can influence the residential choices people make. So in Chicago, for example, there's one area that's very integrated. It's on the near west side, near the village of Oak Park. Oak Park set up a program where they provided free housing counseling. They would find out about thousands of housing opportunities in the region, and they would help blacks to consider housing opportunities in white neighborhoods. In other words, you might go in as an African American, and the counselor would say, well, this neighborhood has very few African Americans, but let me tell you about it, and let me tell you about some of the people there, and some of the people we know, and so on and so forth. And that sort of just has the same effect. It encourages more dispersed moves. It encourages more moves by whites into existing black neighborhoods, and it has a very similar effect to this economic engine that I talked about before.
Professor, UCLA law professor and author of Moving Toward Integration, Richard Sander, is on with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Many of my listeners and many of the audience would at first think, okay, legislation dictating any sort of economic choice is going to be viewed dubiously in the first place. So what was it that made this work where other anti-segregation laws didn't, Richard, in your view? Because I think a lot of people would just initially say, oh, it's a law from the government, it's not going to work very well. And did you find that it worked well, or did it not work as well as first intended?
Well, another good contrast here is between school busing in the 70s and 80s and this sort of mobility policy. School busing, I think, sometimes worked, but a lot of times it was a disaster, both politically and practically. It involved coercion, people being assigned to schools. It involved the safety of people's kids and their concern about their education. And it didn't produce lasting effects, because you can desegregate a school system, but if the housing is still segregated, then eventually the schools will gravitate back towards being segregated. You won't have that steady decline that I talked about with San Diego. Whereas what the Oak Park program did was completely voluntary. It was really just providing better information to people and helping them understand what was possible. So I think that facilitating completely voluntary programs is a much more sensible way to go. And in Oak Park, those changes have been lasting. But the other issue is why do all this? And that's in some ways what we think is the most important finding of the book, is that all the areas where widespread integration has occurred in the housing market have also seen a remarkable degree of black progress towards closing racial gaps. And this is true on every indicator we look at. It's true on black unemployment, single-family households, on test scores. It's even true on death rates. In San Diego, the black-white gap in death rates is two-thirds smaller than it is in Chicago.
Interesting. What about you mentioned that the economics all start to come closer together. What about the other direction? We hear a lot about gentrification and where, for example, a place like Hoboken, New Jersey, is a poorer, mostly rental property area. And in the 80s, a lot of folks working on Wall Street discovered how inexpensive some of these historic old brownstones were. They'd find the hardwood floors, they would buy it, and all of a sudden they were buying relatively inexpensive buildings, turning them over, and very quickly the neighborhood changed and gentrified and became a much more white upper middle class as opposed to a blue collar and ostensibly heavier ethnically area. How do you look at that as part of this equation, or do you when you looked at this?
Oh yeah, very much so. I think it's kind of ironic. Many of my fair housing colleagues are very fearful of gentrification because they see it as a process that's going to disproportionately hurt minority renters and owners. Mm-hmm. But I think it's terrific and important. For one thing, you can't have metropolitan desegregation if migration is only going one way. If blacks are only moving into white areas, for example, then the black housing market, the residual black housing market, will become depressed and prices will fall and people can't afford to move into white neighborhoods anymore. So you need to have two-way migration, and it's better for an urban area for people to be closer to where they work. It's better for cities fiscally to have the middle class returning. So the underlying concern that people have about gentrification is that you'll have massive displacement. And I think that's a legitimate concern that you can address by just putting a certain amount of the housing in neighborhoods affected by gentrification into housing trusts. This is very different from, say, rent control. The idea here is to select individual buildings and put them under a nonprofit status for a period of time, create covenants where the housing costs will only rise sort of with the general consumer price index, and then you put it back into the private market. And it therefore provides a mechanism for making sure that as the area gentrifies, it'll still remain economically and racially diverse.
What about programs? And I do an awful lot of work with our local Habitat for Humanity organization, and they have programs where they've tried to do more. And I've learned over the last 10 years about things I didn't realize about Habitat, because you often only see Jimmy and Rosalind Carter and a hammer and they're building a house. You don't realize, and I didn't realize, all of the economics that go on before that ever happens, where they work with the partner families and try to make sure that the economics works out for them. So when they get the mortgage for the house that's being either renovated or built through Habitat, they can afford it. What's the expression? It's a blessing, not a curse. Are programs like that something to look at in terms of helping break these cycles of poverty that leave people renting, and then when they're elderly, they don't have any real built equity either. So when they leave the workforce, there's not a lot for them to fall back on.
Yes, I agree completely. Moving folks into the home ownership sector is not only a way of building wealth, but it builds independence and all sorts of other social characteristics that we prize. And the key, as we saw in the housing crisis 10 years ago, is to not put people in a situation where they're going to go underwater or get in over their heads, but where they can actually benefit from the housing. Mm-hmm. And I think Habitat does a really good job of that.
When we look at things, and some of our cities here in Virginia have very large gaps, even a university town like Charlottesville, perhaps like many university towns, there's not a lot of industry because the university pursuit is the industry, and in there it's been researched that about 25% of our population can't make $31,000 a year, which is basic rental, electric bills, that kind of thing. when you see that kind of economic, does that need to be addressed first from a policy level, the economic opportunities of a community, before you can really successfully deal with these, whether it be self-segregating or still remaining balkanized communities?
Well, that's another conclusion from our book that I think may be controversial, is that the economics should come second.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Most of our housing efforts are spent on trying to create affordable housing, and the way we end up doing that frequently is to create units that are quite expensive, say $250,000 or even $300,000 per unit, to establish affordable housing. So you're ending up with really, really nice affordable housing, but for very few people. Whereas it turns out that on this 0 to 100 scale I mentioned before, only about 25 points of that 100 points is caused by economic differences between blacks and whites. In other words,
really?
You could get segregation levels down into the high 20s in principle without changing anybody's income. There's enough overlap between the black and white income distribution and enough variety of housing in our neighborhoods for that to be true. So, to me, a much more cost-effective and frankly, I think politically less controversial approach is to focus on integration and get that integration cycle moving so that it becomes self-sustaining, and then that will have these dramatic economic impacts that we've seen in all the integrated cities. So you sort of come around it from the back.
You've talked about several instances where in your research, San Diego, Oak Park, are there policy recommendations in your work moving toward integration that, a Roanoke or a Lynchburg or a Charlottesville or a Richmond can be looking at either at a state level or a local level? And where does it come from? Is it better suited coming from the not grassroots, but the local government level versus the state or federal government down?
Yeah, I think it has to be a local effort. What we suggest in the book, and we actually have a pretty detailed blueprint in the last 40 pages or so, is that we form metropolitan associations, which have already formed to do things like transportation planning. And those metropolitan associations might get funding from foundations or from state or federal government, but they're fundamentally focused on their metropolitan area. And the idea is getting integration as a metropolitan goal and getting the communities to work together to sort of see how can we do these individually small steps in a cumulative way that actually has an impact. So I think this is something that can scale to urban areas anywhere in the United States, and I and a number of colleagues are very interested in working with communities to do that.
How does somebody call you? I mean, I have your number. I don't want to give it out, but I know that there are a lot of folks around here. But, I mean, is there a way to contact you for advice on this, Professor?
Yeah. Sander at law.ucla.edu. You can Google me. You can find out more information from me from movingtowardintegration.com. That's a website on the book. We hope that some of those relationships will start to form.
Now, I know that there have to be policy decisions, but is there also the danger, and I find this all too often with the opportunistic camera-chasing politician, will go out, and it's easy to say, what is the line from Mary Poppins? It's a pie-crust promise. It's easily made, easily broken. That they want to be seen as doing something about it, but actually doing something about it is so much less sexy that it's hard to look at a politician and rely on them. Is there a better way, or do we just need to find good quality political office holders to spearhead this stuff?
Well, it'd be great to find wonderful leaders, but I think if a foundation, for example, was interested in funding an integration strategy in a metro area, in the book we lay out a strategy for Buffalo as an example, and we estimate it would be about $250 million over 10 to 15 years.
That's all?
And I
mean, it sounds like a big number, but then you divide it over 10. I lived in Buffalo for a couple of years, and I know it could use, and there are some beautiful parts of Buffalo that have gone to seed, really, economically, and it really needs this. But that's all. I would have figured a town like Buffalo would have taken an awful lot more money over an awful lot longer period of time.
That's the thing. It's a fraction of what we often spend on social programs because I think we're we're riding market forces, taking advantage of things like the gentrification force, but making it work for integration. So our advice is that any funding that was, say a foundation decided to adopt Buffalo, and a Metro Council forms to try to develop strategies, the segregation results can be directly measured. So you can create real accountability, and you can say, we're going to provide these funds, but only to the degree that you're actually accomplishing results. So you create a real accountability, and you create a sense of urgency because it's a temporary program. It's not something we want to go indefinitely into the future. We're just trying to jumpstart enough integration so that it becomes self-sustaining.
And if it was a foundation, say a nonprofit, led by community leaders, the Tyson family for Buffalo, for example, and they led that, but I mean it would not be about a politician seeking to hold on to an office. So there would be that urgency to have results there because those resources will be finite.
Yep, that's right.
That's a fascinating. I please don't jump ahead to the last 40 pages. We do it in all our summer reading. I know you're all going to see who done it, but Professor, thank you so much for putting this together. And I know folks, when we told them this was going to be the subject of this first part of the program, said what? Because generally speaking, we find that government policies are dangerous. But you've seen and identified, and I guess it's only fair to say when something works, we should point to it and say that worked. Let's figure out what worked within it and make it work more so. And I appreciate your efforts on that.
Well, thanks so much. We all fundamentally do care about racial inequality, and we think this is a sensible and profound way to really start chipping away at it.
Well, nobody who believes the phrase "all men are created equal" as we do here in Virginia, could disagree with that. Again, the website is movingtowardintegration.com. And you can find out more about Professor Sanders' work there. Thank you, sir. I do appreciate it, and you have a wonderful weekend.
It's great talking to you.
Absolutely, and there you go. And that's like a non-cost 3-credit course right there, and that was great. And coming up next, congressional candidate Delegate Ben Cline in the 6th District, running for the seat being vacated by Bob Goodlatte. We'll catch up with him a little bit, and don't forget primaries on this Tuesday across the Commonwealth of Virginia. We'll be right back on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Joining us now from the campaign trail, taking a few minutes out, we'll switch hats somewhere in the middle, but first welcome in Delegate Ben Cline. Ben, welcome back to the program. How are you, sir?
Oh, great, Joe. It's good to be back with you.
Thank you for taking a little time out and catching us up on things going on around the campaign trail, and congratulations on securing the 6th District nomination. We'll get into that in a little bit, but talk to us and take us into Medicaid expansion and where we are.
Well, I fought against extending Obamacare into Virginia through Medicaid expansion.
Thank you, by
led
the way.
The opposition and every minute I could, and we unfortunately were beaten by a teaming of a rump group of moderate liberal Republicans and the Democrats teaming up to pass this bill. It's much like the omnibus that passed Washington last month or two ago that was so chock full of horrible funding, but we weren't allowed to see it written. We weren't given party to it, so I'm not sure what the problems could be at this point. But anytime you do things haphazardly and throw things together at the last minute, something's bound to go wrong. So it wouldn't surprise me if the governor found either a mistake that was made, or if he's having second thoughts about some of the work requirements and other things that my leadership wanted in there. That wouldn't surprise me either. It's just his liberal leanings coming out.
Talk about, even one of the more, compromising spots was the idea that if the federal funding was to go away, that would be a trigger to end the program expansion in Virginia. Even that we couldn't get a unanimity of Republican support for. What has happened in the General Assembly chambers, Ben, to make this happen? Is it simply the the losses in 2017, or is there more going on here that we didn't realize was happening?
You may have that situation with some of my colleagues who are in closer districts. They may be a little bit spooked by the elections last November when we lost about 15 seats, and a lot of good people got beaten, and the real continued drumbeat by the other side when they got here that they wanted Medicaid expansion. I think they just need to spend a little time back in their districts. If these Republicans spent time back in their districts, they would know that their constituents don't want another welfare program. They don't want more government in their lives. They want to be able to make their own decisions regarding their health care. They want to have choices and affordability, and that comes through repealing Obamacare at the federal level and replacing it with some more market-based forces and reforms. Has nothing to do with Virginia coming in and introducing yet another welfare program that is already failing across the country and is going to fail in Virginia if we implement it.
So here's where we segue from one Ben Cline to the other. So at some point, Ben Cline, the congressman, as he's running for the 6th congressional district, may be behind the final repeal and replace of Obamacare. So what would his advice be to the Ben Cline in the Virginia General Assembly to manage that when that comes about? What should we be looking for here in the Virginia General Assembly when that day comes when repeal and replace becomes real?
Well, it is coming soon, and I hope to get there to be able to help it happen in Washington. Our president has indicated he wants to start allowing the sale of insurance plans across state lines so that Virginians, if they can't find a Virginia plan that meets their needs or is affordable for them, they can look elsewhere to, Montana or Washington or Colorado, wherever they can find a plan that is better suited for them, then they can go ahead and purchase it. That's the kind of competition we want. Virginia, unfortunately, has been saddled with so many mandates on insurance policies that we're one of the top states in the whole country when it comes to the number of mandates we have on policies to cover X, Y, or Z.
Oh, I know.
And it makes it much more expensive. So hopefully folks will get relief soon, thanks to our president's leadership, and hopefully we'll be able to codify that into law. I'd like to play a part in that when I get there if I'm elected in November.
Well, let's segue into that, Delegate Cline. Ben Cline will be running for the seat being vacated by Bob Goodlatte. And there are many people who are trying to extrapolate meaning out of what now counting Congressman Garrett's announcement that he will not seek re-election in Virginia's 5th. I think the CNN story had 44 current Republican members of the House were not seeking re-election. Do you, and what have you heard regarding what that's attributable to, or is there one thing that it's attributable to, Ben, in your mind? And
I don't think that there is one thing that you can attribute all of these retirements to. I do think that that a lot of members are frustrated with their inability to get things through into law, the Senate being the problem that it is. And in the House, they have passed a lot of conservative reforms, and I think you're just a lot of them are bottled up in the Senate. But with my own district here in the 6th District, Congressman Goodlatte has been chairman of the Agriculture Committee. He's been chairman of the Judiciary Committee. They term limit chairman to 6 years, and he's coming up on his sixth year as chairman of Judiciary. He would be stepping down from that chairmanship, and if he continued to serve, and I have no doubt he would win re-election if he ran, he would be without a chairmanship and would have a lot of information to provide, but wouldn't have as much influence as he currently does. I do know that he has new grandchildren he doesn't get to spend enough time with, and a lot of other opportunities that he wants to pursue, and he's still relatively young, and so I thank him for his 25 years of leadership and look forward to many great things from him to come in the future.
Your district, of course, was a hotbed because of the case found at James Madison University of, quite honestly, it's not even hypothetical anymore, dead people being registered to vote. Are you concerned that some of that could still be going on, or are you comfortable with the idea that Virginia's State Board of Elections has tightened up on some of the issues that had led to some of the funny business that were going on a couple of years ago?
Well, unfortunately, we are still worried, and that's because we continue to have a partisan State Board of Elections. It's made up of a majority of individuals who reflect the party of the governor. And so right now you have a Democrat leading a Democrat majority on a State Board of Elections that, has tried to make some reforms, but in our view, has not been aggressive enough in preventing the kind of voter fraud that we saw in Harrisonburg, where you did have individuals affiliated with a group led by a former chairman of the Democratic Party there in Rockingham County and Harrisonburg City, who were going and registering deceased individuals to vote. And one of them happened to be a father of a judge and a war hero from World War II.
Lucky.
And the registrar's office caught it, and because this was a famous individual locally.
Yeah.
And it was absurd and tragic and criminal, and the individual, I believe, is serving time in federal prison now for it. And that's the kind of thing that we need to see more of to prevent that kind of activity.
Delegate Ben Cline is on with us. Congressional candidate Ben Cline is also on with us. Ben, your website is bencline.com, if I'm not mistaken?
That's right, yeah.
Ben, I want to talk about Ben Cline, the congressman, the erstwhile congressman, and first and foremost, we've been watching the, quote, generic ballot polls, which are always fascinating to me because I have found that the axiom is true. I dislike all congressmen except my own. He's really good, or she's really good. So I've always wondered how somebody hypothetically would fill out a generic ballot. But the blue wave that everyone talks about seems to have faded even as these polling numbers are going. So what is your sense in the 6th after what was a very contentious primary, but then turned out to be a very well-organized Doc Troxel and Ed Yencho certainly handled the 6th district convention very well, and now moving forward, do you feel like there's any concern for a blue wave, or do you think that the GOP can hold on to the House?
No, I think that this blue wave is just a make-believe on the part of the Democrats. They're hopeful more than realistic. That what they are refusing to acknowledge is that our president is increasingly popular, that he's doing a good job, that the economy is improving, jobs numbers that even the New York Times says they don't have enough words in their vocabulary to describe how great they are, and the generic ballot essentially coming back to close to even, where voters prefer Republicans in the same numbers as they do Democrats to lead them. With those types of trends, Republicans are going to do well in November. I do anticipate the 6th staying red. The Democrats will pick their nominee next Tuesday, a week from today, and I think that we will take that race to the voters. Mm-hmm. I look forward to debating my future opponent, whoever he or she may be, on the issues on my record in Richmond, fighting for conservative causes as chairman of the Conservative Caucus, and pragmatic legislation. And it's not even partisan legislation, transparency legislation to crack down on domestic violence. All these things that I've been doing that are resonating in the Valley and across the 6th District and the 5th, where I think that Denver Riggleman will have a victory in November as well.
Ben, let me ask you this, and you are one of, as I look back on my history, one of many members of this great General Assembly, one of the oldest representative elective bodies in the world, that has gone to Washington. And are you steeled for the frustrations that were whether it be a Morgan Griffith or Tom Garrett or Robert Hurt, many folks who have left the Virginia General Assembly to go on to the U.S. House of Representatives have almost immediately found that the way things are done, and maybe that's an overstatement, the way things aren't done in Washington leaves them frustrated. Are you ready for that? And what kind of things does Ben Cline want to bring to that office that might change some of that?
Well, I think that letting some air out of the tires of the federal government is in order, and I think that if we do that, and empower the states and empower the people, that by doing that you will make the process run easier. Not every battle has to be a life or death battle to the end. And in Virginia, we have limited government. We have a part-time legislature. All of us have day jobs and families and communities to get back home to. So when the battles are fought and won or lost, yes, votes are taken, and yes, those votes might be used by our opposition in campaigns in the future. But you know what? If you've got a good argument, then you'll win. And so we take those votes and wear them with pride. And so, this vote on Medicaid expansion, my opponents may try and make an issue in this campaign. But you know what? Medicaid expansion is not right for Virginia, and I will stand up every day to defend that vote and make the case for a market-based healthcare system. And so that's what we need more of. Members in Washington not being afraid to take votes, willing to stand up and defend those votes and articulating them, and the messaging being smart messaging back to the voters. That's how we're going to move Washington forward out of this muck, out of this swamp, and get some things done.
So talk about the importance of the Senate race in 2018 as well, since we were talking about the intractability and so much of the House's work has just gone into sort of a stasis in the U.S. Senate. Does that make, as important as your race is to the 6th, even more, a support role to making a case that we need to flip at least one of the seats in the Virginia representation in the U.S. Senate?
Tim Kaine's record, forgettable record as senator, has been overshadowed by only his even more forgettable record as governor. He, when I was in the legislature with then Governor Kaine, his most remembered legacy will be that he shut down the rest areas to try and punish us, punish Virginians for failure to adopt his tax increases. And, that's the kind of senator Tim Kaine has become, really ineffective for Virginia, and we desperately need leadership for the Commonwealth in the U.S. Senate because our values, the values of the Virginia way, is not being reflected in the votes of our senators, either one of them. So it's my hope that whoever wins on Tuesday in the primary will be able to highlight the lack of Tim Kaine's record in the Senate and the problems that he is putting in the way of our president, because when voters find out that our president could get his agenda done but for senators like Tim Kaine, then maybe they'll throw him out and put somebody in there who will actually help our president instead.
Talk about getting out the vote, because I know that in the 6th District, again, we always seem to come to this place where we're concerned, are there going to be fractions or factions of the Republican Party that don't come out, and making sure that there's that get out the vote that is as seemingly dysfunctional as the Democratic caucuses can be. They always seem to come out 100% come Election Day. So talk about the get out the vote efforts in the 6th and across the Commonwealth of Virginia in November, Ben.
Well, we've got a challenge. We've got to match the anger of the Democrats against Donald Trump with the enthusiasm of our voters for our president, for his agenda, and for our more conservative policies being implemented. So up in Northern Virginia, we saw last fall that the Democrats turned out in greater numbers, and we didn't turn our people out. Part of that was our failure to embrace the president's agenda fully. And when our people, when Republicans run as simply Democrat light, that doesn't incentivize voters to turn out for Republicans. That doesn't excite the voters. They want to hear a strong, positive, conservative message. That's what I'm trying to articulate for voters in the 6th congressional district, and these voters are conservative. They want to see a conservative message. And so when we do that, we will get more voters out in the 6th and the 5th and the 9th, and we are the breadbasket of Republican votes for statewide races. So if we can turn out in greater numbers, then the statewide races will turn out better, and that gives hope to our Senate candidate, whoever that will be, against Tim Kaine.
So talk about some of the things that Ben Cline wants to accomplish as Congressman Ben Cline. Are there agenda points? I mean, the president has said on frequent occasions, even to some controversy, bring me a bill to sign. He seems desperate to execute the branch of the presidency the way it's supposed to be. You legislate, and then he'll execute. So what kind of bills do you hope to shepherd onto the desk of the president as Congressman Ben Cline?
We have a lot of reforms that we'd love to see done. Back when the Republicans first took over Congress for the first time in 40 years, back in 1994, the very first budget that they put out, that Bob Goodlatte was a freshman, but that very first budget called for eliminating the Department of Education. It called for eliminating the Department of Commerce, and it called for eliminating the Department of Energy. And now that sounds so revolutionary. But you know what? It was common sense back in 1995. And they knew that those bureaucracies weren't necessary and that the states could do the job. And so we need to return to that time when we were passionate about conservative reforms and actually moving to implement them rather than just dancing around solutions. So those are the kinds of reforms I would like to see happen. I'd love to see a balanced budget amendment pass. I'd love to see, very aggressive reforms that have been long in coming, and that the voters are, quite frankly, confused as to why they haven't happened because they are so much a common sense at this point.
One of my favorite parts of visiting Congressman Goodlatte's office is his Balance the Budget board game pillow. Will you inherit that when?
I don't know about that, but I look forward to inheriting his passion for a balanced budget amendment and fighting alongside Dave Bratton and others to make that happen. And I'm just so sorry that Tom Garrett won't be there to serve with. He has done such an amazing job, fought hard for conservative values, and we'll look forward to continuing that fight. And hopefully he'll re-engage in the fight soon.
Is there a cautionary tale in the Congressman Garrett story? These were his own staffers. These were members of the Republican staff roster that went to Politico and started talking out of school, and maybe to the benefit of Tom Garrett. I think at the end, even if something bad happens, but good results are from it, then it's at the end of the day a good thing. But is there a cautionary tale for a freshman congressman like Ben Cline to keep in mind that there are always fins? What does Jimmy Buffett say? Fins to the left of me and fins to the right, and you're the only chum in sight?
Well, you always want to keep a positive working environment, and I know Congressman Garrett strove to do that. And you find good people and you hang on to them, and loyalty is important, trust is important, and it's a two-way street. And so every office knows that. And having served on the Hill for Bob Goodlatte as his chief of staff, I was constantly on the lookout for good, loyal staff who wanted to be part of a positive working environment. That positive working environment is what I'm going to strive to create if I'm elected in November, and one that encourages hard work, but also recognizes that this is it's an important job that requires passion and positive energy. That's what we want to create.
I had forgotten that that is on your resume. You served, and you must have been, 15 when you were Congressman Goodlatte? I mean,
yeah. That I was in my late 20s, and that was what seems like eons ago.
Did you ever think then that you'd be coming back and running for the same seat?
No, that was not in my mind. I was glad to escape the swamp at that point and go back to my hometown of Lexington and get elected to the state legislature and represent the people I grew up with and continue to represent. And, you know, I've grown up, gotten married, had kids, and have a law practice that I love. And this next stage in my life is going to be continued service in a different way. I'm a lot more knowledgeable about the challenges that government can present to you and the ways to cut through the red tape and get things done. So hopefully I'll take some of those solutions up to Washington and contribute to the effort that the conservatives are making to change the system and drain the swamp.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's bencline.com, and have a wonderful weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Joe.
And thank you for tuning in this week to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. For all of us here at the tertiumquids.org, so long, and thanks for all the fish.